On February 12, 1999, Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's longtime friend Silvina Peloso, boarded a plane in Eureka, California. The trio arrived in Stockton, California. Early the next morning, the women checked out of their hotel and then drove 3 hours southeast to the sprawling motel complex called Cedar Lodge. The next morning, they drove to the western entrance of Yosemite, and they have this wonderful day looking at these astonishing cliff sides and snow-covered mountains. So it was just this totally magical day at the park. And then finally, as the sun was starting to go down, the trio finally left the park, got in their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. The women changed into their pajamas and then sat on the bed and watched one of their movies. And then when it was over, they brushed their teeth and then they got in bed, turned out the light, and tried to go to sleep. But a few minutes after their lights were out, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, which was the 16th, Jens, Carol's husband and Julie's father, was anxiously waiting at the San Francisco airport for his wife and his daughter and his daughter's friend. And he's just hoping they're going to come running around a corner and they're going to barely make this flight. But they don't. And finally, Jens, who does not have a cell phone, and neither does Carol, he decides there must have been some sort of miscommunication and that Carol and the girls must have flown on ahead. And so he decides at the last minute to just board the flight himself and fly to Arizona in hopes his family will be there. And so he rushed to the hotel hoping that maybe they were there. They weren't. He spoke to the hotel's front desk and said, hey, has my wife Carol contacted you? And they said, no, she hasn't contacted us and we have no record of her being here. And he spends the rest of the day calling around to friends and family and acquaintances and anybody who might know where Carol and the girls are. But nobody has heard from them and nobody knows where they are. And so that night, as Jens is about to go to bed, he convinces himself that they are probably just fine. This is just some screw up. But when he woke up the next morning and there was just no sign of her or the girls, Jens finally contacted police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens, the first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge, which is the last place they knew Carol, Julie, and Silvina had been. The manager of the lodge would tell police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But Carol had checked out in advance, so the manager would not have seen her anyway. The manager also told police that on the 16th, after the three women should have been out of their room, the cleaners went by room 509, and when they went inside, it was vacant, and nothing seemed amiss. It just looked like the women had left. And so the police reached out to the car rental company to see if Carol had made it to the airport and dropped off her car. But when they spoke to the manager of this rental company, they would say, no, Carol has not dropped off her car, and she hasn't called about extending her lease, which is now overdue. They began operating on the theory that the three women left their lodge motel room on the 16th and then either got into a car accident somewhere and had just not been found yet, or they had driven somewhere, gotten out of their car, and gotten lost. But at this point, the police were not taking seriously the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched in and around the Cedar Lodge complex as well as around the western entrance of Yosemite, but absolutely nothing was found. Then, a few days after this search has started, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards inside of it, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California, which was a suburb that was located about 2 hours west of Cedar Lodge. There was no reason for Carol and the girls to be in Modesto, California, and so this signaled to police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. Then on March 18th, which is about a month after the three women originally went missing, a hiker was way off in the middle of this forest about 2 hours north of Cedar Lodge. When he turned onto this logging road that nobody really ever went down, he sees up ahead the skeleton of a car. It looks like a car had been set on fire. And so he calls it into police, not really knowing what he's looking at. When they searched the car, there really was nothing left. But when they opened the trunk of the car, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies with their hands still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, they were able to confirm the bodies belonged to Carol and Silvina. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie, the 15-year-old, but all hope was lost when just a couple of days into this search, the police received an anonymous handwritten letter, and on this letter was this crude map that showed this very specific spot overlooking a lake. It was Don Pedro Lake. And then on this note as well was a phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using this crude map, the police went to Don Pedro Lake, and there they looked down and they saw the remains of Julie. At this point, police already had several suspects they'd picked up in Modesto, California. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest to the police. They were half-brothers Eugene Dykes and Michael Lorwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks, basically insinuating that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to these three women. And then after Carol, Sylvina, and Julie's bodies had been found, the synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol matched the synthetic fibers that were pulled off of Michael and Eugene on their clothing and from their vehicle when they were arrested. And so the police were very confident that they had their killers and they had them behind bars already. But they still needed to compile evidence before they could formally charge them and make their names public to the media. 4 months went by and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders. But they continued to assure the public that they had their killers behind bars, and so nobody has anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 24-hour shift in the clinic when his pager went off. And so he went to a phone, he dialed the number that was on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up and said, "Hey, Dr. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person?" And Dr. Kidd said, "Sure, I'd love to help." And the park dispatcher said, "Hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one." And then before he could clarify, he hung up the phone. And so as soon as this convoy of other Yosemite staff members that are part of the search rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside, he hopped in one of the vehicles, and he asked the driver, what's going on? And the driver would explain to him that, hey, 4 months earlier, we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing. And while the police have said they have their killers behind bars, the police still have not come out and actually named who their killers are. And so that's made many of us think that maybe they don't have the killer or killers behind bars. Maybe there's a killer or killers still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight, we have another person who's gone missing inside of the park, which has led many of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight. Dr. Kidd was totally shocked at this news, but he was even more shocked when he discovered who it was that was missing. It was somebody he knew. Her name was Joey Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the convoy of Yosemite staff entered into this unbelievably beautiful meadow, and on the very far end across this huge meadow is this one green cabin sitting at the base of this mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joey was living. Dr. Kidd could see park rangers walking around the perimeter of the cabin, marking it off with yellow police tape. They got out and they could see parked right next to the cabin was this white pickup truck. It was Joey's pickup truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage, and it looked like there was luggage that had spilled out onto the ground, and some of the doors were still open. And so it gave Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers the impression that Joey must have either been loading things into her truck or unloading things out of her truck at the time she went missing. Dr. Kidd and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin towards the tree line, and then once they got into that forest, they started walking towards this creek. And as they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and saplings, and it looked like someone had come running through there. And then at some point, one of the searchers yells out, "Hey, what's that up there?" Hanging on a little tree on the ground was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. And so Dr. Kidd began walking towards these keys, and as he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into this ditch right on the other side of these keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom, he immediately began to gag, and he turned around and quickly walked away. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police, and the police sent a police officer to Joey Armstrong's mother's house. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite, and they need her to call them. And then he handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joey's mother, and at that point, the person who picked up quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior, and this person asked Joey's mother, "Are you aware that your daughter is missing?" So Joey's mother says, "No, I was not aware of that." And then this person very delicately says, "Ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin." Joey's mother's reaction was instant. She said, "Well, did you check her hair? She has red hair." And the person on the other side of the line hesitated for a minute and then just said, "Ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you." And so after this call finally ended, Joey's mother was confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? And so she was horribly distraught. She didn't know what else to do. And so she began planning a trip out to Yosemite. She rushes to the airport, and as she's waiting to board her plane, she grabs a newspaper from a nearby kiosk, and the headline reads, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite." And that's when she understood why that person could not tell her whether or not this was her daughter based on hair color. But from the time she got that phone call to this headline running in the paper, these searchers had found the head. It was located 27 feet away, and they were able to confirm that it was the body of Joey Armstrong. Joey's death was immediately treated like a homicide. On the night that Joey went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin, and they noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. And as it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in Yosemite Valley. And so within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up. There was no one inside of this vehicle. But then down this embankment off the highway led down to this forest where there was a river kind of out of sight. And so these 2 officers decide to head down and see if maybe the driver is down there. And sure enough, they come in contact with the driver. He was laying on this rock, completely nude. And so the 2 officers, they come up to him and announce themselves. And this very well-built, good-looking guy stands up and he calmly covers himself and he says, "Hey, what can I do for you guys?" And so over the course of their conversation, the police would learn this guy's name was Kerry Stainer. He was 38 years old and he was the handyman at Cedar Lodge Motel. He would tell police that he was not anywhere near Joey's cabin on the night she went missing, and the police ultimately bought it. And then they walked back up the hill, leaving him down there, and they took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators analyzed those pictures those officers had taken of the tires of Kerry's car, and they compared them to pictures of the tire tracks at Joey's cabin, and they determined they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Kerry down again. This time he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots. It was a nudist resort. There he was arrested on the suspicion of murdering Joey Armstrong, and he was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was booked, Kerry dropped a bombshell. He confessed to not only murdering Joey Armstrong, but also he confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso. And he did all of this on his own. He had no other accomplices, which means the police never had the killer or killers behind bars. It would turn out Eugene Dykes, who was one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about he and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold blanket, and so they did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. On February 14th, 1999, so the day that Carol, Julie, and Silvina arrived at Cedar Lodge, Kerry was on his way to his girlfriend's house. That night, as Kerry walked up her front walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind that he was going to act on a fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. And so his plan that night was he would go inside and he would not only kill his girlfriend, but he would also kill her 2 daughters, who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out this plan, he noticed out one of their windows there was a man in their backyard. And he asked his girlfriend, "Who's that guy out there?" And she would say, "Oh, I hired someone to take care of our properties." And so for several hours, Kerry anxiously sat there constantly looking out the window, waiting for this guy to leave. But the worker was just taking a lot of time, and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. Angry and frustrated, he began driving back to Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the 2nd floor. And when he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed there was a car he had not seen earlier in the day. And so Kerry parked his car a little bit a ways, and he walked over to the room that was right in front of this car. And he peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, and he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside of this room. It was Carol, Julie, and Silvina. And so Kerry stayed back and continued looking through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside of this room. And after a while, he was certain they were alone. He made the decision that he was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, around 11 p.m., he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door and very cautiously opened it up just a crack. He said, "Hi, ma'am, sorry to disturb you so late, but there is a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room." And Carol apparently was just not buying it, but Kerry was very persistent, and eventually he talked his way into the room. He goes into the bathroom, and for a few minutes he kind of pretends to fiddle around inside of the bathroom while Carol is standing right outside looking in at him. And then at some point, Kerry reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and he aimed it at Carol and he said, "Stay calm, I'm not going to hurt you, this is just a robbery." And so Carol very dutifully went back into the room and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend, and before long Carey had tied up all three of them. He put the two teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door, and then he put Carol on the bed, and then he proceeded to Carol before strangling her to death with more rope. And then after she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. And then after he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room. He went to the bathroom, he opened it up, he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying, and pulled her out, and he left Julie alone, cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed before strangling her as well to death with some additional rope and put her in the trunk of the rental car along with Carol's body. And then after that, he went back inside the motel room, and then once again he opened up the bathroom door, he grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to her as well. But then afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. He proceeded to clean up the room and tidy it up, and then after he was satisfied, he grabbed Julie and he walked her out to the car and he sat her down. Carey hopped in the front seat and he began driving off. She has no idea where her mom is. She has no idea where her friend is. She has no idea they're actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. She has no idea where she's going, and all she's got is this blanket around her. Finally, he pulls off the highway down some switchbacks into this big parking lot of the Don Pedro Lake. Carey gets out, he walks around to her side, he opens the door, and he scoops her up, and he walked with her up the trail all the way to this overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. And then as the sun began to come up over the lake, he reaches down and pulls Julie up to her feet, and so she's standing with her back to the lake, and as he's looking at her, he says, "I love you," and then he pushes her down the hillside where she tumbles and finally comes to a stop underneath some bushes where she dies. He drove out of the lot and drove 1 hour north until he was well into this forest, and he pulled down a logging road where he abandoned this car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to Cedar Lodge. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's body were found in the back of the burned out car, Carey would send that handwritten note to police in order to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there really was more than one person perpetrating these murders, hence the "we had fun with this one." Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carey, never considered him a suspect. In July of that year, Carey, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, he was just driving around Yosemite when he noticed there was this woman way off in the distance walking in and out of this cabin that was fairly isolated. And so he drove down this forested road and he reaches this meadow and he's watching, wondering if there's anybody else helping her. And so after a while, when he only sees her, he decides he's gonna go kill her. And so he drives across the meadow and he pulls up right next to her truck and he gets out and he introduces himself. And Carey would proceed to spark up some small talk, and then at some point Carey drew a pistol and he aimed it at her and said, "Go inside your cabin." And Carey followed her inside, and then he bound her wrists and he bound her mouth with duct tape, and then he ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. And then once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carey got in the driver's seat and he began leaving, and as he's bombing across the meadow, Joey leaps head first out of the window of this moving car and smashes onto the ground, and she immediately jumps up and just starts running. Carey jams on the brakes, he hops out and he starts chasing after Joey, but Joey manages to get fairly close to that tree line right behind the cabin before Carey ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. And then Joey is viciously trying to fight Carey off of her, and Carey, kind of in a panic, draws his knife and he tries to slash at Joey, but Joey tucks her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. And so frustrated, Carey just stands up and he grabs Joey by the hair and he begins hauling her towards the forest, and finally they get inside the woods and Carey drags her into this ditch, and once she's down at the bottom, he pulls out his knife and he begins to cut her. He left the forest and went back to his SUV and drove back to Cedar Lodge. Carey would tell police that as soon as he killed Joey Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her 2 young daughters, but police caught him before he could carry out the attack. Carey Stainer, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera that was found intact near the burned out car in the woods. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful time in Yosemite, but after Carey confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images of the camera roll, we know Carey Stainer was either either literally watching these women or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on this camera was taken just moments before